What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so before I get to this video, I want to give a shout out to Bulls Fan 25 for her contribution to the channel. Much respect for showing love to the channel, and I want to thank everybody that contributes to this channel and has contributed to this channel over the past, I guess, year and a half since since I've been taking donations. I want to thank everybody that also has signed up to the Patreon. All right. So I hope you enjoy the content that's over there on the Patreon. I'm going to try to be uploading a little bit more this week. I'm a little bit behind as far as my production's concerned. So I'm going to try to upload a little bit more over the next week. All right. So I'll continue with the top 10 power forward listing. Just to do a brief recap, at number 10, I had Dolph Shays. So at number 9, I have Kevin McHale. All right. Now, Kevin McHale was, of course, one of the big three along with Robert Parrish and Larry Bird for the Boston Celtics 1980s. They won 3 NBA championships in 1980s. And Kevin McHale, when I think of Kevin McHale, I think of the torture chamber. I think of a guy that, along with Akeem Olajuwon, considered the two greatest low post scorers in the history of the NBA. Olajuwon was, of course, the greater player. Olajuwon was more flashy, a more dominant player overall. But McHale, as a low post scorer, just that aspect of his game, probably was the greatest. Just because of the variety of moves that he had, his body, he just was built for that position. Long arms on an already long 6 foot 10 inch frame, long legs. Um, you know, his long arms was able let him be able to get shots off at angles that other players couldn't. The twisting, the turning, the up and unders. And, he just was a very unpredictable and hard player to read sometimes. Charles Barkley said that Kevin McHale was the best player he ever played against. And Charles Barkley, of course, was one of the great power forwards in the history of the league. But Charles Barkley struggled against Kevin McHale because he couldn't read Kevin McHale very well as far as his move set. And Kevin McHale used to give Barkley fits with his length. McHale, when you think of McHale, you don't think of a shutdown defender, but he was an underrated defensive player. He was an underrated shot blocker. Um, he wasn't the greatest rebounder at 7.3 rebounds per game, but you have to take a couple things into consideration. Number one, he played on the front line with both Robert Parrish, who was a naturally bigger man at 7'1" and 240, who usually averaged around maybe 18 points and 11 rebounds. He played with Larry Bird, who was really a power forward playing at the small forward position, the ultimate hustler and overachiever in many ways, who averaged 24 and 10 in his career. And before he hurt his back, Bird used to average more like 11 or even maybe close to 12 rebounds a game. So that's one of the reasons. And also earlier in his career, McHale came off the bench. So that cut into his averages as far as playing less minutes. When you go 36 per minute per averages, his rebounds go up at closer to 40 minutes. His rebounds go to 8.5, closer to 9. So he wasn't a dominating rebounder, but he was decent. All right. To me, Kevin McHale is no longer a top 50 player, but he's definitely top 60 to top 70 in my opinion. And without Kevin McHale, they would have won any of those championships. Now, Kevin McHale was born in 1957 in Hibbing, Minnesota. And as a young man, he was more into hockey than basketball. And there was no indication when he was a young man that he was going to be a basketball player. He was not bigger than average. He wasn't like Wilt, where he was just tall from the get go. He was of average height all the way until his freshman year in high school. His freshman year in high school, he was 5'9". I think by his second year, he was 6'3". And then, the thoughts of basketball and the focus on basketball began. And by his senior year in high school, he was 6'10", his full 6'10", and he was named Minnesota Mr. Basketball, and he led his team to a run-up finish in the AAA Minnesota State Championship game. After high school, Mchale played basketball at the University of Minnesota, and for 4 years he averaged 15.2 points and 8.5 rebounds per game for the Golden Gophers at the power forward position. He was named All Big Ten in 1979 and 1980 and still ranked second in school history in career points, 1,704, and rebounds with 950. It was also in college where he began to learn and perfect the moves that he would showcase in the 1980s. It was his coach that persuaded him to not just be a typical traditional low post man with maybe one or two basic moves in the post. It was there that Mchale learned to not just play with his back to the basket, but to face up as well and be the uh, awesome force that he would ultimately become in the NBA. Now, entering the 1980 NBA draft, the Celtics had the number one overall pick, but they had a problem. They needed a big man, right? Now, if you say you need a big man, well, why not just acquire Joe Barry Carroll? Well, the problem is that Red Auerbach was a genius. All right, I'm gonna give you that. Red Auerbach was a genius. He probably knew or heard some things about Joe Barry Carroll he didn't like, but he wanted Kevin McHale. All right, he saw the potential in Kevin McHale. He knew Kevin McHale would be a great fit on the Boston Celtics. He also wanted Robert Parrish. But Robert Parrish was on the Golden State Warriors. So what happened is the Boston Celtics offered the Warriors, who had the third pick, I think, the number one draft pick, and a future first round pick, and maybe something else too, in exchange for the first round pick. The Warriors jumped all over that opportunity, used the first round pick to pick Joe Carroll, who was projected by many to be a superstar in the NBA. And be that Carroll was a center, that made Robert Parrish expendable. And they agreed to trade Robert Parrish to Boston Celtics. So Boston acquired Robert Parrish and Kevin McHale in that situation. Joe Carroll would go on to become a decent center who had some all-star years, but he never lived up to his potential. He was not very passionate about basketball, and that earned him the nickname, the derisive nickname, Joe Barely Cares. And he's one of the. I guess you would call him a bust. He could play, but he just didn't dominate because it is what it is. Speaking of that, I do want to mention one criticism of Kevin McHale before I go further. One criticism of Kevin McHale, it even comes from a teammate, Larry Bird, even said this, all right? So it's not from a place of hate. One criticism of Kevin McHale was that he was too nice a fucking guy. He was too nice. And that, if he took the game and had the mentality of, say, a Larry Bird or Michael Jordan, or Kobe or whatever, even Shaq, you know, if he had a mean streak to him and was a little bit more of a selfish player, he could have easily been a guy averaging 30 and 10. And I think Larry Bird says this from the place of a guy with limited physical ability, and he made the most out of his game. And he sees this guy, McHale, with all these physical gifts, and he's thinking, like, damn, if I had these gifts, do you know how unstoppable I'd be? So I think that's where he comes from, where he's coming from with that. But I know Bird was one of the biggest critics of McHale. but they got along. They're friends. It wasn't like mean spiritedness, but you know, back in those days, people weren't pussies the way they are now, where if you criticize them, they get mad and whatever. But initially, with the Boston Celtics, Kevin McHale came off the bench. All right, in that same vein that Frank Ramsey and and John Havlicek had, and this worked. His first year, 80-81, the Boston Celtics won a championship against the Houston Rockets. I think McHale averaged 10 points per game that year. And over the next couple of years, he would come off the bench, and his role would grow each year. His level play got better each year. By, I believe, 1983-84, he won his first Six Man of the Year award coming off the bench. And his role was very vital in the Boston Celtics winning the championship that year in a scintillating 7-game series against the Lakers. Cedric Maxwell was phenomenal in that series, though, in many games. And Cedric Maxwell was the 1981 NBA Finals MVP. Cedric Maxwell is, as of right now, um, the only player to win Finals MVP not in the Hall of Fame that's eligible. Although I have a feeling that Andre Iguodala is going to join him after he retires. I don't think Andre Iguodala is going to be in the Hall of Fame. So just wanted to share that to you right quick. Um, but by the mid '80s, there was a changing of the guard as far as McHale and his role on that team. Um, in 1984-85, McHale won his second consecutive Six Man of the Year award. And I also want to say this about Kevin McHale. I think that he repopularized that position, that Six Man of the Year award. Prior to him, I think that people kind of fell out of favor with that. People want to generally start in the NBA, and coming off the bench could sometimes be seen as a demotion. But Kevin McHale repopularized that, and it showed the essentialness of being a Six Man of the Year award, six man a player who's providing energy coming off the bench, scoring, and oftentimes down the stretch of games when every possession becomes more important, especially in a close contest. That six man can be pivotal. And when you think about, look, after him, you had, of course, guys like Bill Walton. Um, then you had, of course, Detlef Shrimp, be a Six Man of the Year award winner. John Starks with the Knicks. So these roles became very important over time. And I think Kevin McHale helped to popularize it. But 80-45 was a year of change, as I said before. And what happened is this: Cedric Maxwell was a starter, but he got injured, I think in February of '85, and McHale went to the starting lineup. And what proceeded to happen was McHale dominated. In a March '85 game against the Detroit Pistons, Kevin McHale set a franchise record with 56 points to go along with, I think he had something like 10 rebounds or something in that game. And 2 nights later against New York Knicks, McHale dropped 42 points. The 98 points in 2 games is still a franchise record for most points in 2 consecutive games. And although McHale would never again drop 40 points again in a game, and that's part of why I said Bird said he wasn't as aggressive as he should have been. Um, the statement had been made. And by the way, 9 days after McHale dropped 56 points, Bird reclaimed, Bird claimed the new franchise record of 60 points against Atlanta Hawks just 9 days later. Show you how competitive Larry Bird was, right? As a person. Um, but the writing was on the wall. McHale was going to enter the starting lineup. Prior to the start of the 85-86 season, Maxwell was traded to the Clippers, basically in exchange for Bill Walton. Bill Walton became the sixth man for the Boston Celtics. and Mchale was put into the starting lineup. And for the first time in his career, Mchale averaged over 20 points per game. I think he averaged 21.3 points per game that year. And Boston went 67-15, and they steamrolled through the NBA that year, and they beat the Houston Rockets in six to win their 16th NBA championship and their third of 1980. And it looked like Boston was on the verge of having just a dynasty going into the 1990s. They had just acquired Len Bias, and it looked like they were going to be a tremendous team for the future. But tragedy struck just 36 hours after acquiring Len Bias. Len Bias died of a cocaine induced massive heart attack. And then you saw the slow decline of the Boston Celtics. Initially, what happened? Bill Walton broke his foot for the 998th time of his career, and ultimately that proved to be the death knell of his career. I think he retired by 1988. I think Dennis Johnson got hurt that year. Danny Ainge got hurt that year. Larry Bird was starting to show some of the injuries that would eventually become the hallmark of the second half of his career. But initially, because of this, Kevin McHale was shouldering more of a scoring load and was having the best season of his career. Um, that year, McHale averaged 26 point, I think it was over 26 points a game, and he was averaging almost 10 rebounds. He became the first player in 86-87 in history to shoot over 60% from the floor and over 80% from the foul line. I think he shot 60.4% from the floor and 83.6% from the foul line. So that's the thing, man. Look, you couldn't stop him in the post. And if you fouled him, most likely he was going to hit his foul shot. So it's like you really couldn't stop the guy. There was a stretch from February to March where McHale averaged 30 points and I think something like 11 rebounds a game, and he shot 72% from the floor. But it was a March 1987 game against the Chicago Bulls where McHale suffered a fracture in his foot, and instead of shutting it down and having surgery, he played on his fracture. And as a result of him playing on that fracture, he played 39 minutes a game in the playoffs. All right, because he wanted to win a championship that bad, wanted to repeat. The fracture got bigger and bigger and bigger and worse in his foot. And even though he led the Boston Celtics in scoring during the finals, um, this would be the last time we would really see Kevin McHale as Kevin McHale, the ultimate scorer. Um, he would have all season surgery, miss a portion of the next season. He would come back, but he never quite was the same explosive player. Okay, he wasn't the same guy. At the same time, Larry Bird that year, 87, 88, had a phenomenal season. He averaged almost 30 points a game that year, 52%, almost 53% shooting from the floor, almost 90% from the foul line, 40% from three. He had a phenomenal year. But the writing was on the wall with the Boston Celtics. DJ was getting old. Robert Parrish was getting old. Bird was starting to break down already because of his style of play. McHale, maybe a little bit of it was his structural, the way he was built. He was starting to break down. A lot of times when you have these tall, gangly guys, the first thing that breaks down on them is their feet. You know, um, I should know. You know what I'm saying? I should know this one. In '88, the Boston Celtics made it all the way to the conference finals. But by the conference finals, Bird was becoming hobbled by bone spurs. And McHale, although he led the playoffs, I think, with 25 points a game, He was not the same player. As the 80s went into the 1990s, the Boston Celtics just aged. They got older. Bird began having the injuries after the surgery, the bone spurs, the back issues. It was just terrible. Um, Coaching changed over time. I think at first when Mchale got there, I think Bill Fitch was the coach. Then ultimately it became who was it? Casey Jones, who was the coach during the heyday of the Celtics. But then I think Guy Rogers succeeded him. Then Phil Ford. I'm probably missing the coach here or there, but there were changes. Bird came back. He started to become a little bit more of a gunner. He got criticized for that. Mchale went back into a six-man role for 1 year, became a starter again. But he was not the same player, man. He was not the same player, and um, the Celtics now relied more on their younger, quicker players, not just Robert Parrish, Mchale, and Bird. They needed help. That's basically what I'm saying. You saw the emergence of Reggie Lewis, who also would have a tragic end to his life, not just his career. But by 1993, the writing was on the wall. Mchale was a shell of himself. I believe that was the only season in his career where he shot under 50% from the floor. And the last game he ever played as a Boston Celtic was that miracle shot made by that game where Alonzo Mourning made that 20-footer at the buzzer against the Boston Celtics back when he was with the Charlotte Hornets in '93 in the first round. I think they came back from a 2-0 deficit or something like that in that series. And after that game, Mchale announced his retirement. After he retired, Mchale began working for the Minnesota Timberwolves from 1993 to 2009, with his roles varying from being a head coach, general manager, and even a TV analyst. He was the head coach of the Houston Rockets from 2011 to 15 until being fired following a 4-7 start to the 2015-16 season. Mchale currently works as an on-air analyst for NBA TV and Turner Sports' popular NBA on TNT studio show. When you look at Mchale's achievements, they're considerable. He was a three-time NBA champion, a seven-time NBA All-Star. That's with him not being a starter initially. He was on the All-NBA first team in '87. Three times he was on the NBA All-Defensive first team. Three times NBA All-Defensive second team. Two times he was the NBA Six-Man of the Year award winner. He was on the NBA's All-Rookie first team in '81. He's on the 50th anniversary All-Time team. His number 32 retired by the Boston Celtics. First team All Big Ten in 1980. His number 44 is retired by the Minnesota Golden Gophers. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, he was Minnesota Mr. Basketball in 1976. For his career, he averaged 17.9 points per game, 7.3 rebounds, 1.7 blocks per game. Although if you look at his per game averages, it's more like 28 and a half and 2.5 blocks. And his coaching career, 232 wins, 185 losses. And Kevin Mchale, the Hall of Famer, one of the great big men of NBA history. Number 9 on my list. Tell me what you guys think.